Next up, we have a really interesting fireside chat with award-winning podcast host Jacquelyn Melinek and former CFTC Commissioner Summer Mersinger. This is going to be an interesting conversation, not just because we're sort of up against clarity, but also because this is Summer's one-year anniversary at the Blockchain Association, which is really special. So we'll get the chairs up here so they don't have to stand. That could be an interesting session. Can you imagine, Jacquelyn? Would your knees be ready for that? I don't know. I've got weak knees. It's really tough, you know. I've been doing a lot of strength training with my trainer. And so he had me doing like these types of things. You know what those are called? Box jumps, I think. Really hard, especially when you've got a little too much weight, you know, like me. But not Jacquelyn, strongest knees in the podcast game.
Okay.
Enjoy the session.
We're not going to improvise this session the way he just did that. But yes, hello, everyone. It is great to see familiar faces. I am Jacquelyn Melinek. I'm the founder and CEO of Strata Media. And more importantly, I am lucky to be sitting down with Summer Mersinger, the CEO of Blockchain Association. And as Frank mentioned, it is your one-year anniversary.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Genius and me, kind of a one-year anniversary.
I know. I mean, when you stepped into the role, you came from the CFTC prior. What was kind of the transition like, and has it gone as expected?
Yeah, the transition was very abrupt because when I was the regulator, we spent a lot of time reading and pontificating and, you know, kind of coming up with our opinions. And this has been nonstop on the ground, you know, meeting with members, meeting with the administration. So it's definitely like the pace, it's very fast. But I think what was most notable to me is just kind of our members. You know, there's so many really smart people out there building really interesting things. And, you know, their willingness to be involved in the government to help us, you know, work on a regulatory framework has been really amazing. So a lot of it, you know, the dedication of the members, but also just the amazing things that they're doing, it's beyond what I could have possibly imagined.
So did Genius pass when you moved to the Blockchain Association, or it was like right before?
It was right when I moved. I made.
So you caused it.
I made the joke. I'm like, I don't know what everyone else was doing, but I showed up and Genius passed. So.
Yeah, there we go.
But no, there was a ton of work that happened that led to that moment, and I was very grateful to be there when it was passed and signed by the president.
Yeah. So maybe if you get a new job right now, clarity will pass too.
I mean, we got to get clarity.
Yes. What has surprised you the most from moving from being a regulator to now leading an industry association? Has anything kind of changed your assumption over the past year? Yeah,
I think it, you know, kind of the dedication. You know, I think as a regulator, you're a little bit, you know, we still met with stakeholders, but you weren't immersed in their world. And that how different, you know, what they do day to day is beyond, you know, from what a regulator is thinking that's going on has been really interesting. It's easy to forget as a regulator that people are running businesses, they're building, you know, America, they're building their economy, and we're looking at it only through the regulatory lens. But when you can step back and see how it impacts the entire economy, that's just a view that I felt like is missing from some of the regulatory agencies and the regulators.
Are you more optimistic now about the building of crypto startups, blockchain startups, and companies in general in the U.S. Over the past year?
Yeah, and we've seen it reflected in our membership. We've got members who had, you know, not much of a U.S. presence before, bring new jobs, new business here in the U.S. We've seen a lot of growth, and and a lot of new startups. So it's definitely, you know, the U.S. is the leader here, and the companies that, you know, both make up our association, but, you know, make up the digital asset space at large, are really driving the economy.
Yeah. And I mean, we talk a lot about Genius, and we're going to be talking about it a lot today too. But it's obviously changed the conversation in Washington. There's been a huge shift in focus on the stablecoin narrative. Yeah. Everyone wants to launch a stablecoin or get some implemented into their fintech, bank, whatever it may be. How do you think that created momentum then for market structure regulation, though?
Yeah, stablecoin was, we call it kind of one leg of the three-legged stool. Stablecoin legislation, clarity, and then we also have taxes, which is kind of our next.
We always have taxes.
Always have taxes. That's not going away. But I think what clarity proved is that Congress can pass good digital asset focused legislation. I think there was an assumption for a long time that there wasn't enough knowledge on the Hill, that they wouldn't get there because there was a huge education gap. And what we saw with Genius is they can get it done and they can pass good legislation. And so it really is driving the momentum for clarity. I think people it added some trust to the process. So I think this whole year past Genius has really been driving us to this moment with clarity.
So where do we stand with clarity? I know we were talking about it off stage, and I was like, how do I even ask this question of where are we?
Where are we?
Yeah, what's going on? I feel like every single day, every time I refresh my feed, there's something new going on.
Yeah, and it is, and you get different stories from different people. We've had our members on the Hill with us. We've been in, I think after today, we will have met with 13 senators, but in 35 offices in the last 3 days overall. And I think what we're finding is, they are very close on the main part of the language. The Senate banking bill and the Senate agriculture bill are going through the process of being combined. There's just a few little nits that they're still working out, but for the most part, staff feels good that they've gotten to a place where there's some agreement. And ethics is the big elephant in the room, right? That's what we hear from every office is that it's, we've got to figure out ethics. Today, there's a meeting at the White House with some Republican senators that, we're hopeful that an agreement comes out of that and that it's something the Democrats will accept or that they can, make some changes but get to an agreement. What I've been saying in all these meetings is the biggest tragedy here would be to lose all this great work on clarity because they couldn't get to the perfect agreement on ethics. And so that really is kind of the linchpin right now. I'm hopeful. I think the right conversations are happening with the right people. So I think we can get there. And then once that agreement is done, they're going to move fast. I think, there's some recognition that these agreements are a little bit fragile and you can't just let them hang out there for a long time. So if they get ethics, they get that language, they'll put the language out and they will probably schedule a vote shortly thereafter. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a vote early next week. And it'll be a motion to proceed, and it'll be a cloture vote on the motion to proceed. It's a procedural vote, but it does need 60 votes, so that's really going to be the test. And I don't know if we will have a good idea until that vote starts as to the outcome of the vote.
Where do you stand on the ethics provision? Because I know there's two sides to the coin, yeah. Right? And people are going back and forth. And maybe for context, we could explain what's going on there too. And I think later today we'll see where things land. But yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
It's a hot topic, and for my members, and what we are advocating for on the Hill is look, whatever you decide on ethics, that's really not our concern. That is politics. That's Congress, that's the elected officials, but please don't let it kill all the hard work that we put in the rest of the bill. Don't let it take down this important bill that creates this framework, because we need to be leaders in this space, and the only way to do that is to get a federal framework in place. Other countries are waiting for us. This is our moment, this is our chance, and so that's really been our argument is do what you need to do, but please don't let that kill what we have done so far and how far we've come and how hard senators and staff and House members have worked on this legislation for a lot of years.
Right. And then I know there have been some maybe changes to the text. What would you say are the biggest additions right now or changes that you're most encouraged by?
Yeah, there have been some discussion around, we saw some law enforcement groups come out against the BRCA, which is the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. I think there was some discussion of, do you change that language, which we were very much opposed to. My understanding is that there's probably going to be some new resources for law enforcement that might be part of this bill that's really helpful, that kind of helps nullify that argument, because those are very plugged-in constituents with these offices. And so a lot of members have said to us, I need my law enforcement okay with this. And I think a lot of it is getting them additional resources. There's been some just kind of changes around the edges in the Senate Agriculture draft from where the House was, but it's not terribly different. And banking, they had to do a few things to get a bipartisan markup. I don't expect a lot of change at all in the banking committee. And I actually think the yield deal will hold too. I don't expect any changes to yield. I think it's going to go forward with the Tillerson Brooks compromise.
The yield deal will go forward. Is this going to make Coinbase happy or not happy? In what capacity?
Yeah, what I've said to everyone, when we talk about the yield agreement, it's crypto did not win. This was not a win for crypto. Certainly we didn't lose to the banks, but we gave up. We went in good faith, and we were there recognizing that you got to give something in a negotiation, and crypto gave a lot. So to have the banks turn around and not acknowledge that agreement after it was done was really frustrating because of how much we had conceded to get that agreement. So I'm really pleased to hear that that's the plan, is to go forward with the current agreement between Tillerson and Brooks, because that was heavily negotiated. A lot of people had to give up a lot to get there, and it would be a shame to reopen that negotiation when crypto showed up in good faith.
In general, where do the banks stand with the crypto industry, and obviously Clarity in mind? I'm sure you're talking to some of them.
Yeah.
Is it blown out of proportion the way it's portrayed in the media, which... I'm part of that, but I'm not blowing it out of proportion. But I know, there are people out there that are really, writing about it. I saw a report from The Information yesterday that said, Coinbase and JP Chase usually have partnerships, but apparently they're, pulling back on some of them. Obviously, the rift between Brian from Coinbase and then Jamie Dimon from JP Chase is public. People have seen that in the past, but... Do you think it's actually blown out of proportion and that banks are on board with this in general, or that they are kind of not very happy?
I think banks see the promise in the technology. They recognize that this is an upgrade to our financial services system, an upgrade that's desperately needed. And so that piece of it is, I think overblown, because eventually, blockchain will be part of everyday banking for all of us. That's the technology is that good, and that kind of changing the way the markets work. So I do think sometimes the competition aspect is overblown. I think the banks kind of elevated it with the yield debate. They really made this kind of a crypto against community banks, which is unfortunate, because in no world do I see some reason that crypto would take over a community bank. I said my mom worked at a community bank. My dad's a farmer. He has all his finances at a community bank. It's also where he gets his operational loan. There's no way he's going to move his money to stablecoins. So I think the banks really kind of blew that argument out of proportion, and it really has given this feel of it's banks versus crypto. But at the end of the day, we're going to be partners. That's how this is going to work out. So a lot of it is Washington theater, I think.
You didn't sell your dad on stablecoins?
No.
We got to bring him to this conference.
They're starting to get some Bitcoin miners in my home county. And when the first one was built, my dad's like, I don't know what they think they're going to find under that land. There's nothing to mine.
Oh, there's Bitcoin down there.
He's like, I don't even know how to start with this. So that's his level of understanding.
That's fair enough, fair enough. All right, well, we'll send him a stable coin. I'll send him one on me. I want to ask, on a level of, let's say, 1 to 10, how confident are you that clarity will pass?
Yeah, it depends on the day. We had great meetings with a number of senators and staff yesterday, Democrat and Republican. People want to get to yes. They want to support this bill. The kind of political discussion that you hear where it's, now this ethics fight, they want that issue solved so they can support this. So I'm at like 8.5, 9, and I don't know if that'll change until the vote starts. And honestly, I think it's going to be interesting. If they're comfortable with the ethics deal, I think we might have a big vote. If they're not, it may be a partisan vote. Mm-hmm. And we just won't know until that vote has started, I think.
Is there a timeline for this?
I think early next week. I think that, they recognize that certainly they have 3 weeks left in the Senate session. If there's any hope of getting this back over to the House, I think they want to move quickly. So, I could see a procedural vote early next week, but some of it is, can they hammer out some of these language, questions that they have to actually get this bill released? Because senators need a little bit of time to read it, to digest it. So that's an important kind of next step, is to have that text released.
Yeah. I know you've also described clarity as more than just an industry bill. It's not just for crypto, but the broader U.S. economy and financial system. Can you kind of walk us through why that's so important? And then for people outside of crypto, like what this legislation would mean for those markets?
Yeah. A lot of it is just kind of what it would unlock in the United States. There'd be more investment. Developers would be here developing. We'd have, the innovation that comes with this space would be happening here in the U.S. And these are job creators. I mean, these are small businesses, are creating jobs, so it's really important to the economy. I think the other side of that is, if we don't lead, we're going to cede that to somebody else. And who's going to pick up that, kind of ball and run with it? I don't think it's going to be someone we want to see leading the space. So it's critically important, even from like a national security standpoint, that we have a federal framework so that this industry can thrive and grow here in the United States. I think the other piece to this that people don't talk enough about are the consumer protections involved. They don't exist without this bill. The disclosures, the segregation of funds, having an entity be examined by regulators and ensuring that the funds are where they need to be, that's missing right now. You have state regulators who are ill-equipped, not saying anything bad about it. I think they would admit they're ill-equipped as well. Ill-equipped, underfunded, and they're supposed to be the ones regulating these big exchanges. Just is not going to work long term. So it's really important that they have this federal framework so that, again, money transmitter license were not made for crypto. We need federal regulation that is made for crypto.
Yeah. So not to be doom and gloom, because we're gonna keep having fun up here, but like, what would ultimately happen if clarity doesn't go through? Is there a chance for second act, no pun intended, or like, what do we do?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a number of setbacks throughout this process. What I've been impressed with is like how engaged and positive the industry has continued to be, even with those setbacks. So should this vote fail, I don't think that's the end of it, because again, this has to happen. So, I think we'll go into kind of another probably period of negotiation. It will get a little complicated with the elections coming up. But, certainly as an industry, we're not going to let this die. I also think, as Congress is maybe not, if they're not acting in this space, what you'll see are the regulators really stepping up and offering a little bit more, using the authorities that they have to try to create a framework. It will not be as thorough or as kind of durable as legislation, but they will do what they can to try to provide some regulatory clarity in this space. So it really will kind of, we'll keep working on clarity on the Hill, but there will be kind of a refocus on the CFTC and the SEC and Treasury and others to kind of see what they can do through the regulatory route.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you about one of the more discussed pieces in the bill too, which was the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, or BRCA. From your perspective, why are developer protections so important to get right? And what problems are pieces like BRCA solving? Maybe some context there for people who don't know what that is.
Yeah. What's interesting about BRCA is it's really how things should work. And under this administration, it is how things are working, which is if you're developing code, if you're putting out code, you're not custodying funds, you're not a centralized entity, there's no reason that somehow a criminal statute would impact you, or really any regulatory statute. You're just creating code. You're not handling people's funds. You're not directing any kind of activity. And so having those developer protections are critical. I think what we will see if we don't have BRCAs, this will all be developed offshore. And what people don't think about with that is, you talk about law enforcement. If you have this developed here on shore, the industry wants to partner with law enforcement. They want to help them. And so having the developers here, being able to go to the developers and say, we see this protocol being used in this way, help us understand, what you developed and what, how they're using this. Those conversations won't happen if this is all being developed offshore. So it's really important that we get those protections in place to make sure that development happens here in the United States. And it's both, national security, law enforcement. There's just a lot of reasons that we want to protect developers in this space. And, we go back to the internet, people were creating the internet, nobody was going after. Yeah, there's all kinds of things going on there, but, you don't necessarily hold, the developers liable for what people are doing on the internet.
Yeah. I mean, it's a conversation I've had a lot too, where it's like, if someone creates a technology and then someone goes and uses that technology for bad, are they held responsible? Yeah. No, I would argue, because they weren't the ones who were doing the bad things, right? But then the argument is that this developer protections could create some loopholes, right? So how do you reply to that then?
Well, what I usually start with is, just going back to the simplest kind of look at this, and I always say, what if the government, came down on Ford because Bonnie and Clyde used a Ford to commit all their crimes, right?
That would be fair.
That would have, it's stifle the innovation.
Silly.
We wouldn't be driving the cars we have now. And I think we've got to look at it the same way, which is if we come down on these developers for actions that criminals are making, it's just going to slow down the innovation. So, I think to your point, you need to remember that, if there's a crime committed, a crime is still committed. It's just, who are you going to hold accountable? You should hold accountable the criminal. There's no loophole here. That is the case now. That'll be the case going forward. If someone misuses a protocol for criminal activity or inappropriate activity, that individual is liable for their actions.
Right.
But it should not be the developer.
Yeah. I mean, to that point about crime, there's been a lot of discussion about law enforcement concerns. How does the current version of the Clarity Act actually kind of strengthen the law enforcement's ability to combat illicit finance, and then also, to that point, allow innovation to prosper?
Yeah. A lot of it is just having this federal framework, having this in a regulated space that changes a lot of oversight. Having a regulator that's looking for activities that are not permissible, being able to flag those for law enforcement. That's critical. There's some language in here around Bitcoin ATMs, which has been a concern for law enforcement. So this legislation addresses that. I think there's a lot of public-private partnerships that can occur in this industry with law enforcement that's just not occurring now. And it's a combination of not having that kind of federal framework where it brings everything together. But there's also a bit of, kind of PSDD from the industry, and they don't know if they can trust. They're not going to go forward with everything if they're like, well, we don't know if we're going to be held accountable. This kind of goes back to the BRCA too. A developer might not come forward and say somebody's misusing my protocol if the fear is they're going to get charged. So I think it opens the door to a lot of public-private partnerships. It definitely creates laws where they don't exist. And it's that kind of certainty where that there is a regulator looking at this activity, and they're going to catch something and be able to work with law enforcement if it is something that needs law enforcement's involvement.
How do you think about building more trust in this space when we just get these unfortunate sporadic DeFi exploits that kind of set things back? So for lack of better words.
Well, I think, it's in any industry, there are going to be setbacks. There's going to be misuse. It's just the nature of, moving money around the world. What I found interesting about some of these, some of the hacks and some of these concerns with DeFi protocol and tokens being, people taking tokens and stuff, is that it's blockchain. They can trace this. They can get that. They can freeze those accounts. They can recover those funds. If we're talking any other kind of financial, way of moving money, that's not necessarily the case. If you're using cash and it goes to an illicit activity, that's gone, and there's no way to trace it. So this is traceable, and so I think being able to demonstrate to lawmakers, to the public, that yes, these things are going to happen, but we can react quickly and we can fix the problem, and at the same time find who was liable and who did the bad, who was the bad actor here. I think that is what's going to prove to the public that we do have the tools in place to make sure that there's some sort of accountability, and that it's not going to bring the whole system down because there's one incident. It's a strong system, and people will figure out ways to continue moving forward after these unfortunate situations.
And it makes me think of consumer protections, yes, which are part of the Clarity Act too. And I think it would provide more protection to everyday users than what already exists,
yeah,
right?
Yep.
So it's a good thing.
It's a good thing, and I think people forget, it's not just the disclosures that are going to come with a federal framework. I often go to the fact that, having customer funds segregated and having them, remote from a bankruptcy, that does not exist today. That will exist. There will be customer segregation requirements. There will be disclosures about who owns the token, who's, the stakeholders. There's going to be so much more information available to the consumer that just can't possibly be required right now. That this is a consumer protection bill at the end of the day. This is the way you protect consumers. And I've been using, kind of not to go back to FTX because it's kind of a bad memory for everyone. But what I will say is if FTX had been registered with the CFTC as an exchange, none of that would have happened. They would have known where the money was. The customer funds would have been protected. They would have had a lot of oversight. There would have been examinations of the exchange. So preventing another FTX-like incident really does require federal legislation, and that's how you're going to protect consumers. The status quo does not protect consumers.
Yeah. And it's, I think, fair to say that if we do get better consumer protection, then it kind of creates a bigger TAM for the market as well.
Yeah, yep, absolutely.
Yeah. I think, in the crypto space, people have been talking about regulatory uncertainty for years, the enforcement by what? How do you say it? What's the the line?
Yeah, exactly. Regulation through enforcement.
Regulation through enforcement. I always mess this up. But if clarity passes, and we're optimistic,
Yes.
we got an 8 or a 9 out of 10. Then what's next for regulatory uncertainty in that argument? Is everything certain then, or do we still have things that we need to iron out?
Yeah, not everything will be certain. You'll find areas where things need to be ironed out, but giving that authority to the regulators so they can write rules and they can fix things, it's critical. That's step one. So it's not going to be a perfect law. They might not get the regulations correct the first time. I go back to Dodd-Frank. I still haven't finished all that rulemaking. I was at the CFTC when they were trying to redo there was a position limits rule that came out of Dodd-Frank that they were still trying to get it right in 2019. And that's almost 10 years later. So that's pretty typical. It's not unusual that there's some fine-tuning, but you need to give the agencies the ability to do that. And the only way to kind of make sure that they can fine-tune the law is by providing the framework through the law.
Yeah. I want to loop back to what we were talking about at the beginning and kind of your 365-day journey on this side of the sphere. You've spent your career at the intersection of regulation, innovation, and now you're vouching for so many different startups, members, et cetera. Are you more optimistic today about America's ability to lead in digital assets than you were, let's say, even a year ago? And if so, why? What's really driving that?
Yeah, when I first started the CFTC, I started in the Office of Legislative Affairs, and it was kind of the first time that there was a bill that was being discussed on the House side. We were working with House Agriculture staff, with CFTC employees, trying to figure out what would be the framework here. And what I found at that point was there was just this huge lack of education. People just didn't understand, and by people I mean Congress. They did not understand what this technology was, why it was important, what it meant for the United States and the economy. And as a commissioner, I would do briefings for members, and I remember the first one that I did, there were a lot of questions of why do we need this? Why is this legal? Why are we even doing this? And as time went on and I did more of those briefings, the tune changed. They got it. They understood it. They understood the opportunity here for the United States. And seeing that evolution, it's really positive. And honestly, now when we go into some of these offices, the technical questions we get it's just crazy how far they've come. And so that makes me really optimistic that, we have become part of the mainstream, that we will be an important part of the economy, and that's recognized by lawmakers and regulators and politicians now.
Can you give us any insight to any recent conversations you've had that would spread some optimism in this room?
Yeah, we've met with a couple of Democrat senators this week. More than a couple. We've had a lot of meetings, but what I'm finding is they want to get to yes. They don't want to vote against this bill, and so that makes me very optimistic. It's not. They're not looking at it as this is a Republican bill and we're not going to support it. They view it as this is our bill. We've been involved. Our staff has been involved. We've all been working on this. This is our bill, and we want to be for it. And that's why I'm kind of at a 9, because, people have worked really, really hard on this, and to let that work, kind of fall away because of, one or two issues would be really unfortunate. So I think that's been probably the most promising thing, is this idea of this is a bill that both sides have worked on. They've created, been working a long time on it, and this isn't a partisan bill.
I love that. Okay. As you look to your second year as CEO of BA, what are priorities for you? Obviously clarity involved, but maybe aside from clarity too.
Yeah, the third leg of the stool, taxes. We've got to reform the tax system.
I always forget about taxes.
Yes, I always forget about taxes. But that's talk about how far the industry has come. You have House Ways and Means debating crypto tax as we speak, and you have the Senate focused on crypto legislation. To have both sides of Congress looking at legislation that will kind of unlock this industry is really notable when you think about, 5-6 years ago, they were like, why do we even need this? So it just shows you how far the industry has come. And so taxes is a big one. Assuming we get clarity, making sure those regulations reflect stakeholder engagement, that they are done in a way that recognizes that, this should be a cooperative process with industry. Writing rules takes a long time. Fine-tuning the rules takes a long time. So that will definitely eat up a lot of the next year. But I think there's probably other things that are going to come online that we don't even know yet. There are going to be other issues. A good example right now is the Illinois digital asset tax. It kind of came out of nowhere. But we got to do something. And so I think there are going to be, things like that pop up, especially in the state level. So we still have a lot of fights to fight.
Yeah, I was going to ask on the tax side, you brought up Illinois, and I was thinking about that because we've talked about that recently on Crypto in America too, but it's like, is that going to be common where we start to see state level, provisions popping up? I don't know if that's the word you would use, but like state level enforcement or different things for taxes on this front.
Yeah, and I think that could be the case if crypto doesn't come out strong in this particular against Illinois' law. We have to be a strong force. We've got to show that we're all together in this, and make sure they understand that you can't do that. You can't put a tax on an industry specific. It's unfair. It's targeting an industry versus something that taxes should focus on, which is kind of the getting public money in the door. This is very much a politically directed tax. And so the hope is that if we can be a united industry and really push back on this, that will maybe keep some of the other states who think they could do this, let them, they'll see that we're not going to sit by and let this happen. But I could see other states, looking at opportunities. It's kind of like anywhere there's money, government's going to try to tax it. So it's not surprising.
100%. All right, finally, Summer, if you can take your crystal ball out and look to the future, let's say a year down the line, where do you ultimately want us to be? Because I think a year is a long time in this space.
It's a long time.
Yes.
Yeah, I've been with the Blockchain Association for a year, and it's felt like
a lifetime.
5. Yes.
And in a good way.
Yes, in a good way. In a good way. Yeah, things move quickly in this space. And and we want it to move quickly. We don't want to stifle that. But yeah, looking at the crystal ball, again, I just see blockchain being part of the financial system. I see this as not crypto versus banks. I see this as this is giving consumers better options to be in the space, giving consumers options to move money faster, to access bank-like products that they might not have access to now. I think we're gonna fill a lot of gaps in the current system, and I really look at this as going forward. It's not going to be crypto versus banks, but it's going to be the financial service, the upgraded and better financial system that America's leading on.
I love it. Amazing. Well, Summer, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes, and thank you to everyone for listening in.
Yes, thank you, Injective.